This is a continuation of the upper room discourse as Jessica taught us last week. This is a conversation that's taken place during Jesus' final meal with his followers. These are his final instructions to them. And he's seeking in this passage to both comfort their fears about what's to come, but also prepare them for the very difficult road that they have ahead of them. We begin today's reading with the last of the I am statements that Jesus makes here in the Gospel of John. Jessica talked a little bit about it last week. Throughout the book of John, Jesus declares several I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the good shepherd. Before Abraham was, I am. Now that's not good grammar, but isn't that what, when Moses was there in the wilderness and God was giving him his marching orders to go back and free his people in Egypt, he said, God, I'm going to have to tell them what your name is. And God told Moses, he said, tell them I am, that I am. So Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And they knew what he meant by that. Last week we read Jesus as saying, I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the light. This morning we get to his last such declaration about himself. He begins by saying, I am the true vine. And my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine. No more can ye, except ye abide in me. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me ye can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my word abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit. So shall ye be my disciples. This idea of a vine, this plan of God being a vine that bears fruit, is one that goes back into the Old Testament. In Psalm 80, the psalmist wrote, Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt. Thou hast cast out the heathen and planted it. Sort of a prophecy of Jesus' time in Egypt and coming back to be planted in Israel. That image of God's plan, God's people as a vine, also comes up a lot in the writings of the prophet Isaiah. In chapter 5 he says, For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, the men of Judah his pleasant plant. Chapter 27, Isaiah also writes, He shall cause them that come out of Jacob to take root. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. But along with that image of vines, there is also over and over this imagery of pruning. Again, in Isaiah, this time in chapter 18, he says, For the harvest, when the bud is perfect and the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he shall both cut off the sprigs with pruning hooks and take away and cut down the branches. Vining fruit, unlike some that would grow on a tree or some other way, requires more attention than other crops. For it to grow healthy, it has to be pruned. Unfruitful branches will pull nutrients and energy away from the rest of the plant, and the rest of the fruit will suffer. I'm not a gardener, but I'm married to one, and I remember a couple years ago, Whitney decided she was going to remove all the suckers from her tomato plants, was going to be real diligent about it. We didn't get as many tomatoes that year, but the ones we did get were gigantic and delicious, and they were prettier than any she'd ever grown, because they didn't have those weaker fruit, those unfruitful branches pulling the nutrients away from the fruitful branches of that vine. So Jesus is the vine. God the Father is the keeper of the vineyard. He prunes off the suckers that don't grow fruit. But those branches that are removed, now that they're not connected to the vine anymore, they were already unfruitful, but now what do? They wither. They're not good for anything. They bear no fruit at all. They're nothing good for nothing more than kindling. Meanwhile, Jesus tells us those that abide, those that remain connected, bear fruit, bear good fruit. Jesus tells us that his Father receives glory because these fruitful branches bear fruit. And what is the fruit that we bear? Of course, Galatians tells us, doesn't it? The fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. You go on to read in this chapter, and Jesus talks about the importance of love in this plan of salvation. This is the fruit that we grow as we're connected to Jesus. And I think, given all this Old Testament context that his disciples would have heard as he's speaking these words, they would have made that connection between what Jesus is saying and what was written in the Psalms, and what Jesus is saying and what was written in the prophet Isaiah. We know who he's talking about when he talks about the fruitful branches. He makes it clear he's talking about his disciples. They would have also understood what he meant by those unfruitful branches. Those who have become unfruitful in this plan of salvation. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the ones that have rejected Jesus, that have looked face to face with the promise that God had been making all of those years, and yet have chosen to reject it, have chosen to disassociate themselves with this true vine, and are now withering and dying. Good for nothing but to be cast into the fire. Mm-hmm. That is a scary thing to think about. Because these are people that have spent their entire lives studying the Word of God. They have dedicated their entire lives to the service of God and the keeping of the law. By their bloodline, they are the lineage of Abraham, who God chose out of all the people to make a special promise to. Abraham, in your seed, all the world will be blessed. Your heirs will be as the stars of the sky. A promise that God reaffirms over and over to Abraham's son Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, to all the generations down the line, to David, to Solomon, promising again and again and again that the salvation of the world is going to come through their bloodline. And you read about how God strove these Pharisees and Sadducees and the people that followed them, their ancestors. God strove with them, though they were rebellious and idolatrous, turning away to false gods again and again. Yet God showed mercy on them because God knew what was coming down the line.
Yes, He did.
God showed mercy, hoping that eventually they would get it right. Only for the generation that met that promise face to face to turn their backs on him, to reject him. The generation that got to see what God had been promising for thousands of years, saw it with their own eyes, saw the mighty works of God, heard the preaching, the words. They said again and again, never a man spake like this man. Heard what he had to say, and yet refused to be connected to this one true vine. And so they withered and died. It's a harrowing thought. But I want to tell you this morning that there is still hope for an unfruitful branch.
Come on, buddy. Come on.
It's something that the Apostle Paul thought about, evidently, quite a bit. Because at one point in his life, he was one of those unfruitful branches. A Pharisee, he tells us himself, of the strictest set. He was a persecutor of the church. You get the sense that Paul understood how close he was to the pruning shears when he met the true vine on the road to Damascus that day. And while he was glad, I have no doubt, he tells us how glad he was to see Jesus working in and through these churches that he planted, as he watches Gentiles who weren't part of the promise of God coming into the faith by Paul's own preaching. While he sees all this, at the same time he watches his own countrymen, who the promise had been made to all those years ago, continue to turn away, continue to reject this gospel, this fulfillment of the law that Jesus brought about. And it was a difficult thing, we can see in his writings, for Paul to see that happen. Of anybody, these should have been the people who understood what Jesus was all about. But in the 11th chapter of Romans, Paul sits down to write about it. He says, I wrote down the wrong verse. Give me just 1 second. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, talking about people that are of the same lineage of me, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit be holy, and the lump is also holy, if the root be holy, so are the branches. Notice he's using the same root and branch imagery that Jesus is saying here, that Jesus draws from the Old Testament. In verse 17, Paul says, if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, he's talking to the Gentiles here, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Paul says, Gentiles, you weren't part of this. You were a wild olive branch. You've been grafted into this great budding tree that was the plan of salvation. Don't boast because you're now part of this thing. There had to be a keeper of the vineyard. There had to be a master gardener to come around and gather you and bring you into this plant, this root that we're talking about. Where one branch was broken off, were shoots of a completely different plant brought into this original root and now draw life from it. Paul says in verse 19, thou wilt say then the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. He says you're telling the truth. Because of unbelief they were broken off. And thou standest by faith. They were broken off because of their unbelief, and you're included because of your faith. But he says, be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. If this is the fate that God has assigned to the ones who received the promise, what do we have to stand and boast about when we've just been grafted into a promise that wasn't even ours? If he did that to the natural branches, what will he do to thee? Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. I told you there was hope for an unfruitful branch. Paul says here that if they continue not in their unbelief, though God has pruned them from the plant, they can be grafted in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? There's hope for an unfruitful branch. Paul talks about the goodness and the severity of God. There's hope even for disobedient Israel, that they can be grafted back in. Paul goes on to say, though he warns us that it's a mystery, people have debated the meaning of this for a long time, but Paul says right here in Romans chapter 11 that it's a mystery. He says, all Israel shall be saved. Somehow, some way, the goodness and the severity of God is going to ensure that the saving power of Jesus sets out to accomplish the promise that God made so long ago. The power of what was accomplished on the cross, so much more important and profound than we can even imagine. A victory that's all-encompassing. Death, Paul says elsewhere, death swallowed up in victory. There's hope for an unfruitful branch. Though they were destined to be firewood, Jesus can reconnect them, can graft them back in
Sure can.
to the true vine. And that's true for any one of us that has become unfruitful.
Right.
Jesus so often spoke in parables because it allowed his listeners to root their understanding in real life experiences. And when he speaks here of a vine and branches, his disciples could easily picture what that would look like. You would be hard-pressed to walk down the road in this part of the world and not pass by a grapevine of some kind. Wine was such a part of their daily lives. Everybody was growing it. Some historians go so far as to believe that Israel, where Jesus and his followers grew up, was where where grapes were first domesticated, thousands and thousands of years before Christ. There were vineyards all over these places. Even though these boys were, tax collectors and fishermen, they would have known a few things about vines. Again, I'm not a gardener. I'm just married. But as I was preparing this lesson, I was thinking about what little bit I know about vines. And I asked her what would happen if you had something like a grapevine. Because I know that, one of the big tasks every year in the springtime, once your tomato plants get going real good, you got to go out there and you got to stake it, right? You got to give them something to grow on. Peas have to do the same. Cucumbers have to do the same. You got to have something for them to grow on. I said, what would happen if you didn't have something for them to grow on? And she said, well, they'll find something to grow on. I'm like, that's true. I've witnessed that on my own back porch. I've got a bunch of vines I got to tear out of some lattice here in a couple weeks. But I said, well, say it didn't find something to grow on. What would happen? She would say, well, the vine would grow along the ground. And when it would begin to bear fruit, it would stay so wet on the ground that the fruit would get a fungus and begin to rot. So I said, for a vine to be as fruitful as possible, it has to be raised up on something. Hours after Jesus makes this proclamation, I am the true vine. Abide in me and you'll have life. Just hours after, he'll be arrested. Do you know where they arrested him? In an olive grove. So as they lead him out of that place to his trial, he's no doubt passing under branches that are tied with wild olive shoots that have been grafted in. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. He'll be subjected to a rigged trial. He'll be beaten within an inch of his life. Then he'll be forced to carry a cross through the city of Jerusalem to a hill outside called Calvary, where he would die the humiliating death of a rebel. And when he got there, they would have laid the cross on the ground. They would have stretched his limbs out on the cross posts, nailed him through his joints into the wood, and then likely using ropes or pulleys or something, they would have raised that cross into a hole that had been dug there for it to sit in. And as I was preparing this lesson, I wondered if anybody in the crowd there, maybe the few disciples that were still hanging around, as they looked on that terrible, grotesque sight of their Savior, their friend, hanging on that cross, I wonder if any of them thought of a grapevine. For the true vine to bring forth fruit, for the true vine to bring forth as much fruit as possible, it had to be lifted up. Jesus said just a few chapters earlier, after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem that we taught about a few weeks ago, he said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me. He said, I'm the true vine. And just like a vine, he had to be lifted up so that he could draw fruit. Now, even we that were not part of this thing, that were unfruitful, can be grafted in so that we can draw life and produce fruit. And even if we sometimes find ourselves dried up, unfruitful, even if the pruning shears have been applied, there's still hope that we can be grafted in, because in that true vine, there's as much life and power as we'll ever need. Thank you for your attention.